Okay, so welcome everybody to today's presentation. Just a few housekeeping things as we go. If you could just put yourselves on mute while the presentation is going on, and then feel free, you can unmute yourself to ask any questions that you might have. Or if you want to use a text chat, you can do that as well. So I wanted to welcome our first time speaker, and hopefully we'll be able to have you back at some point again, Amanda Caputo. Did I say it right?
It's Cupido. You were
Caputo.
close.
Oh my gosh, I'm sorry.
It's all okay.
She's an award-winning producer, the founder of Lead Podcasting, and the author of Let's Talk Podcasting. So we're really excited to have you here today, and welcome, and I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you so much, and great to see you both, and all of you who are watching online afterwards. Hello. I'm going to share my screen now, so we're going to get into the session, and there we go. Great. So, welcome to Podcasting for Business Growth. We're going to just get it full screen. Here we go. So a little bit more about me. My background is in radio, and so I've been a lover of audio storytelling for a long time. I started out as a radio producer, and then I eventually worked as a reporter and a news anchor, and most recently as a program director, mostly in talk radio stations in Toronto. But all the while, I was making podcasts. So I made my first podcast in 2010, which was long before they were as popular as they are today. And I immediately saw the power in podcasting. Fast forward to 2018, that's when I wrote my book, Let's Talk Podcasting, The Essential Guide to Doing It Right. And then last year, I did my first TEDx talk about the power of audio storytelling. I also teach at Seneca Polytechnic and Toronto Metropolitan University. I helped to revamp their radio courses to include podcasting and to have my book being used as their course book, which is exciting. And in 2020, I launched my business, Lead Podcasting. And so this is a podcast production agency that helps businesses and thought leaders produce their own shows, end-to-end support. And so I've just been, seeing a lot. So not only have I been following the industry quite closely, but I've produced more than 30 podcasts in the last 3 years alone. So a lot of anecdotal references and experiences too that I'll be able to draw upon throughout this presentation. So before we get started, I just think it's good to level set. How did we get here? And so for people who might be new to podcasting or maybe are just listeners, I'm going to talk a little bit about the evolution of the industry, which I think will be beneficial as you begin going down this journey of maybe making your own podcast. So a brief history, 2004, that's the first time a podcast as we know it was quote unquote invented. Now, many people will say, what is a podcast? Well, we define it, the original definition of a podcast was audio that you could stream or download through an RSS feed. And so this is kind of like the RSS technology that bloggers were using to have people follow blogs, and you'd get a notification when a new blog post was up. Same with audio. You're getting a new notification when a new episode is up. And so this iteration of it, this definition of it, really came to fruition in 2004. And the tech behind it that was leading it was Apple. And so the word podcast actually comes from a combination of iPod and broadcast podcast. And so that's why in 2005, the word podcast was the word of the year. And there was an uptick in excitement, experimentation, and popularity. But then it kind of flatlined for a bit, mostly because there was no tech evolutions really to continue to push the podcast industry forward. At this time, in order to listen to podcasts, if you might remember this, but if you don't, I don't blame you, because it was hidden. Like, to get to podcasts, you had to go into Apple Music or iTunes, and then there was a separate tab that said podcasts. And so it wasn't even an app of its own. It was kind of buried within Apple devices, and that was the leading podcast player. In 2014, several things happened. The biggest thing from a tech perspective was that Apple actually made it its own app. It removed it from within the music app and made podcasting its own app. You'll see this icon on the screen here that was isolated, and you usually see it on a purple background. And Apple put that on all iOS devices. So huge uptick. People were now seeing podcasts front and center, clicking on that, experimenting with listening, made it a lot easier to find. Discoverability really, had a breakthrough moment. The other thing that happened in 2014 was that we started seeing mainstream success of shows. For most notably, Serial. That's a great example I like to lean upon. Some of you might have heard of this show before. Serial is essentially about a man who was convicted of murder. He'd been in prison for more than a decade, but still maintaining his innocence. And then a journalist kind of reopens the case and starts trying to see, could this man have been wrongly convicted? Many years later, the ruling did indeed get overturned, which is incredible. And it's not just because of the podcast, but you've got to know that the podcast did have this, effect on so many English speaking audiences. There was this public outcry in defense of him. It won the hearts and minds of people all over the world. And that definitely contributed to having a lot of eyes on this case. And so it's interesting to see what kind of public movements can happen because of podcasts. Now, that podcast broke all sorts of records that it still holds to this day. So that was released in 2014. There's been multiple seasons of this podcast since then, but season 1 was the real one that cut through the noise. Then since 2014, year over year, we've been seeing growth in listenership, growth in production, accelerated technology advancements. It's really been a strong uphill since 2014 with growth. Then 2019, right before the pandemic, their ears started really perking up. All right. They're seeing there's money to be made. They're seeing there's technology opportunities and business opportunities. And so there was a little bit of a frenzy. A lot of the big players wanted to give Apple a run for their money since they had been leading in the industry for so long. And so players like Spotify started trying to make their mark in the space, and they bought a bunch of shows and technology and acquisitions. Amazon also buying up a lot of production companies and trying to make a mark for themselves. So a lot of these companies started to all want to get some skin in the game. And that's why I refer to it as the acquisition frenzy. It was like every week there was a new announcement of one company buying another company, one company getting exclusive rights to a show. And then that kind of the acquisition frenzy died down a bit. And now we're in this phase of iterations and regulations. And I call it that because we've got iterations within those acquisitions. There's still experimentation going on. Spotify just rolled out another new update following an acquisition of one of those companies. So they're still just trying to figure out how do all these pieces fit together. And regulations, because there is no body regulating the podcast industry because it is global. So a lot of media regulations are bound by borders, and we have Canadian regulations that oversee the radio airwaves, but who's overseeing the podcast airwaves? There's no one body. And so right now that's still sorting itself out. So it's an exciting time. It is still a young industry, and obviously you're seeing the date here, 2004. It is podcasting's 20th anniversary this year. But because there was such a gap between 2004 and 2014, it really does still feel like it's in its infancy, in its evolution of getting to know itself and finding its foundational elements. All right. That was a lot of information, but let's chug along by the numbers. There are more than 5 million podcasts. That's a big number. And every time I go look, the number is more. But what I want to say, and sometimes that number can intimidate you and say, oh, there's so many podcasts out there. Why should I make one? But listen, that number is very inflated. And we don't even actually know the real number because so many of those podcasts, I was about to say half of those podcasts, but it could be even more than half, are actually inactive. People would throw up 3 episodes back in 2010, and the podcast is still technically there, but they're not publishing actively. They were people experimenting. And so there's no real tracker for how many active podcasts there are. There's also no real tracker for like a certain threshold of episodes. So someone could literally have put up one audio piece and then it's counting as a podcast, even though they didn't even really do anything. They were just kind of testing it out. So don't be intimidated by that number. Ad revenue in the US alone set to be $4 billion this year. And that keeps going up year over year. And this trend is indeed global. Chile is seeing the largest growth in new monthly listeners as of 2002. And so every year I find a new country is the one over, like, who kind of takes the claim in the largest growth of new monthly listeners. Prior to Chile, it was South Korea. And prior to that, it was Spain. And so I've just been following it for the last couple of years. I find it very interesting where we're seeing it pop up, but it is truly a global trend. When it comes to Canadians, we know that listeners are educated, affluent, and if you look at traditional genders, split pretty evenly, 55-45 between men and women. And honestly, that number tends to be like, shifting within the 50-50 range every year. So globally, I just want to go back to that to highlight some more recent data. This is from March 2023. And the question was, how many hours per week do you spend listening to podcasts? And this is the percentage of adults who listened 1 hour or more per week. So not monthly, weekly. So now we're actually getting into like high listening numbers. But you'll see this heat map and people might be surprised to see that the US isn't even leading the charge with these kinds of numbers. And we are truly seeing it all over the world. So truly a global trend, which I find really exciting. Best practices. We have 4 things here that I like to tell people as they navigate into perhaps making their own podcast. Here are 4 things that I really recommend you keep front and center. The first one is authenticity. So, podcasting, we know, creates a real bond with listeners and hosts. People who listen to podcasts, they say that they feel like the hosts are their friends, that the hosts are some of the highest trusted influencers in their lives. And we know that because hosts tend to break down those walls of like, having, for instance, on radio, this like big booming voice and you feel like the person's on a pedestal. Whereas a podcast, it feels a little more accessible, a little more like your friend, and a little like you're actually sitting in on a conversation. And so you want to really lean into that. That's the power of podcasting. Number 2 is creating a sustainable schedule. So once you start publishing, wanting to publish at a regular pace. We don't want one episode here and then 5 weeks later another one and then 2 weeks later another one. Like having that sporadic and ad hoc schedule does not bode well with the algorithm, and it's tough for you to manage. And so really being honest with yourself about how many episodes can I make and how can I sustainably release them consistently, because that's going to be the best way to build an audience. Number 3 is lean into a niche. So don't try to be everything to everyone. There's so many podcasts out there. And if you're just going to do some podcasts where you're interviewing people about amazing moments in their life, it sounds lovely, but there's a million other podcasts out there that are like that. So what is going to be your differentiating factor? One of the beautiful things of podcasts is that it unites smaller communities that have niche interests and brings people together. So for instance, I always like to give the example of the history show, Hardcore History. If you like history, you probably know of this show already. And if you don't, no worries. But this show is just retelling moments of history. It's just one guy who tells a story, and his podcast episodes are like 3 hours, 4 hours, sometimes 5 hours long. Okay. This, for me, not for me. Okay. I'm not a history buff though. I'm not the target audience. And if this guy would have pitched it to a radio station, a 5-hour history story just told by one person, no breaks, I mean, it would have never gotten picked up. But because he had the platform of podcasting and he knew clearly that history buffs would love this, he went forth, he made it. His show is a massive success. It is his full-time job. He has a fan following all around the world. It's incredible. Hardcore History, if you want to look it up. Dan Carlin just really breaking barriers and busting through records in the podcasting space. And the last thing is about format. Now, we're going to get into some examples of formats in just a moment and explain what is a format. But I want to just pause here because I know I've just talked a lot. So, are there any questions about anything I've covered so far? All good? Yeah. Andrea looks good. Okay. Thanks. We'll just keep going. So, being intentional with your format. What is a format? When I say the word format, when I'm talking about format, I'm talking about how the show actually comes together. What is the rhythm of the show? What is the show? How is it going to be presenting the stories and information and conversation? And so here are four main examples of formats. So the first one is a one-person show. So this is just someone sharing stories, talking. A lot of comedians do this, and they basically do a stand-up act, and that's their podcast. It's just them. Okay, one-person show. The next one is chatcast. That's very common, and you will see too that lots of people, because the chatcast is all that they listen to, that's where they default to when making their own. But what I like to say is, it's a good one, right? A conversation kind of feels like fireside chat, an interview. And it's obviously a great way to position your podcast, but it might not be the only way. And so just being very intentional, is a chatcast the way I want to go to present this information? Another example is narrative. So we use this word in the industry. Narrative is like pretty slickly produced. It's very journalistic. It has clips and script that weaves the story together. This is like what Serial was, if you listen to Serial, or This American Life, some of these really big traditional shows, where it takes a lot of work, but it sounds almost like a documentary. And the last one is called scripted. And even though others have a script, it's just in the industry, we call this one scripted. And that's when we have a fictional story that is told by voice actors. This is like an ode to the radio dramas. They're going to have sound effects and a script that they're following, like a like a play script, like a movie script, right? Like with actors and prompts. So when you hear the word scripted, that's what it's referring to in the podcast space. And so here's these four buckets that you could start looking at. And what I like to say is, don't be afraid to mix and match, right? I think here's a common mistake I'll see. We have a host who's so knowledgeable about a topic, and then they invite a guest. And the guest is also knowledgeable, but the host needs to like share their knowledge. And so they have the guest sitting there, but then they actually go on a 5-minute, rant about a certain topic. All the information is brilliant, but then the guest is kind of awkward and just sitting there because they've positioned it as if it's the format of a chatcast. But really what that person needed was a one-person show. And maybe they still wanted the guest, but they needed a moment for themselves. And so that's an example where I say, don't commit to chatcast from the beginning. If you have a way to set up the story and you want to tell your own story, don't let someone sit through it. When you have someone sitting in front of you, you got to be engaged in a dialogue with them. So maybe your format is a mix of one-person show and chatcast. You can have an opening that's just one-person show, and then you're presenting a topic, a problem, a solution. You spend your 5-10 minutes just owning the floor, and then you say, now we're going to welcome a guest, and you get into the conversation when you have them there. So that's just one example of how you can mix and match two of these formats. So thinking about, if you have an idea for a show, thinking about what's the best format for me given what information I have to share, what stories I want to tell. There's going to be a different one that might fit better, depending on what that content is. Okay, gonna pause one more time. Any questions? We all good?
There's none in the chat, no.
All right, good. Thanks. Yeah, keep letting me know.
Maybe Andrea. I think Andrea.
Oh, Andrea, yeah.
Hi, Amanda. So I just have some questions as examples, because I'm a big WTF Mark Maron fan. So I'm using that as my guide for podcast format, just so I can qualify and just do a little research on my own, because I didn't realize that there were 4 categories. So WTF, would you say that that's a one person show or a chat cast?
Yes, it's a mix sometimes because sometimes he just does a thing like in the beginning, right? And that's a great example. So if anybody knows this show, I actually highly recommend it. Mark Maron's a comedian. And so he'll do a little bit of a bit. Every episode's a little different too, because he has, I don't know, 1,000 or more episodes now at this point. So if you go back to and you listen, he's evolved. There's been ones where he would just talk and one person, but then the moment he gets into the chat with someone, he's really good at doing an interview. So yes, you nailed it. I would say it's a mixed one-person show chat cast.
Okay. So just so I have an idea of that. So then in terms of narrative and scripted, would you say that, I know you said it a few times and maybe I missed it. So narrative is like serial,
Yeah.
like a documentary,
Yes,
right?
exactly.
And then scripted would be basically like a table read. For I'm a writer, so I'm thinking of a podcast for my own. I have a book of poems that I'm thinking about making into a podcast, or even adapting one of my scripts to a podcast. So I'm
Beautiful.
just
That
kind of,
would be
because I'm, as a
scripted.
writer, I would say narrative, but now I'm thinking I should say scripted.
Correct. You nailed
Correct?
in
Okay.
this industry. And we are going to listen to an example of a scripted right coming up. So you're going to hear another one too, which might give you inspiration for how to approach yours. But that's exciting.
Okay. Great.
Thanks
Thank
for
you.
sharing and clarifying.
There's a question in the chat. Do you
Yes.
need a professional studio or just good mics to do a podcast? And what were those top podcast regions on your heat map?
Oh, yes. Okay. So we're going to get into equipment recommendations at the end. So I'll just say hang tight because I have some nice screen grabs. And let's just go back quickly to the heat map. So we're going to see here that we actually have South Africa, which is a real big pop. You'll even see here that Mexico, it appears to me, being darker than Canada and the US, right? Like I thought that was very interesting. But we know that Spanish podcasts are very popular Spanish speaking podcasts. And so I would say being mindful of the different languages that knowing that like it's just beyond English. Like we just think of English speaking podcasts, but there are so many. Obviously, we're seeing a lot lighting up in Europe. I've actually been to Italy, and Italy has more listeners than Canada, which is crazy. Excuse me. So I went to the Milano International Podcast Festival, which was very exciting. And like they just have a very robust podcast culture there. And so I think it is. And India also, I'll point out too, India has a very big podcast listenership. They actually have their own app called Ghana that they listen through. Like they're not really listening through Spotify, like a lot of Europe is. So you'll see that depending where you are in the world, different areas have different trends around podcasting. And so I just think that just, you could also do a quick Google if you want to learn more, but those are just some highlights I would point out. Okay, we're going to move on. So now actually we're going to get into some examples. And I think examples, Andrea, you nailed it. Like that helps clarify the learning. So we're going to talk about some podcasts and we're going to do a quick little listen of some podcasts. So here are a bunch of podcasts that my company has made. And now, so this is specifically about podcasting for business. All right. These are all podcasts that are connected to a business. Now, some of these you might have seen. Stress Test, for instance, definitely cracks the podcast charts and it gets featured quite often in Apple, and that's connected to the Globe and Mail and has to do with personal finances. But some of these you probably never saw. Sleeman Brewery's called Life at Sleeman. That's an internal podcast. That's actually a private podcast that is not made publicly available, but they do for their employees. It's an internal employee engagement tactic. There's some of these other ones. KJH Insights might not have seen. That's okay. They don't necessarily, the main goal for some of these is not to crack the Apple top charts. They all have different goals depending on their audience and their larger strategy of where the podcast is fitting into. So what I'm also trying to do for business owners here is to get you thinking about what is that goal? What audience are you trying to target, and what do you want to happen because of your podcast? So here are some examples of goals you might pick for yourself and for your podcast. Audience growth, sure. That's, the most, the first one that probably comes to people's minds. Well, I want to get a lot of listeners. I want to crack Apple top 10, all of these things. All right. That's great, but that's hard. And that might not actually be what's most beneficial to you or your business or your brand. So let's look at some of the other goals you might have around your podcast. Product or service sales. And so if you reach 1 million people, but not a single person buys what you got to offer, then is that success? Maybe not, right? And that's where we say, well, let's, instead of tracking just listeners, let's put a promo code at the end of the podcast and see how many people actually buy something after listening to the podcast. And let's track that number. And maybe that's our goal. Let's just try to get 5 sales. So that's one example of a goal you might set for yourself. Some other ones are more qualitative, increasing trust in a leader. I worked with an organization who had a CEO that was beloved, and he was switched out, and a new CEO came in. And honestly, people just really had such an affinity for the previous leader. He just needed to build some trust with the audience. And so by launching a podcast, he was able to have people get to know him a little bit, feel like they were building a friendship, showing some authentic side of his personality. And that was the main goal, just to increase that trust in the specific person. And you're going to brand your show around that person if that's the goal. You might even put their face on the podcast artwork. You might include their name in the title, right? So if that's your goal, you're going to take a very different approach to how you brand your show and develop your show. Another goal is brand affinity. So maybe it's not around one person, but it's around a brand, and you want your company name to be front and center. All right. So if that's the case, how are you going to pick a title for your show? How are you going to position the brand within the episode, right? It's a whole different approach. So getting really clear on you can't have all of them, right? The tactics would actually conflict. So you want to have a very strategic approach to how you are doing this in order to get the max amount of growth in the area you want it. Strengthening partnerships. This is a brilliant one that I think some people don't even realize. I've had leaders, and we're going to listen to this as an example coming up. Someone that I worked with who said, you know what, great, I want to make a podcast to say I have a podcast, great, but what I'd really love is to get some people that I've never spoken to before. That would be a cold contact, and just start to turn them into a warm lead. And so I'm going to invite them on the show, and they're going to come. We're going to have a great conversation. We're going to have a laugh. They're going to get to know me. And then I'm going to follow up in 3 months and say, do you want to work together? And she actually used it as an approach to turning cold leads into warm leads. How brilliant. And then built partnerships with these guests, or wanted to have someone that she wanted to be side by side with optically for her brand. So it was all like a relational play. Really smart. And also, I think people love being on podcasts. So you might shoot your shot with a person you would think that's totally outside of your realm of connections, and you might be surprised what they say. The last example I'll give is search engine optimization. I had another leader who was launching a website. His ultimate goal was to sell product, but he's launching his website and he had no content for his website, new business. And he hated writing, and he just thought, but he had so much information, such a knowledgeable, it was in the health sector. And he's like, but I could talk forever about inflammation and the benefits of turmeric and all of these things. And so we said, let's just do a podcast. It's going to be keyword rich. We're going to transcribe them, and we're going to turn it into your blog post. So really, we sat down for half a day. I just let him, we had different topics. He talked about all of them. We chopped it up into a little series. Sure, the audio is available for people to listen to, but really what we wanted was to download that information from his brain to the page. And we were able to use the podcast as the basis for all of the content that he ended up putting up on his blog. Brilliant. So that or on the website, so that he could launch with a robust website with information. So another really interesting tactic where he wasn't looking to crack the Apple top 10. He was just looking for some written content for his website. All right. So let's take a little listen to some of these examples. So the first one is relationship building. Here's Angela, a friend of Paro, actually. So you might recognize her if you've been out to some events. So she worked with Lead Podcasting, my company, and she was the one who was using her podcast for relationship building and to turn cold leads into warm ones. And she has said too that some of the people she's had on her podcast have really shot up in popularity and made waves in the news. And she was just able to re-release those episodes and just look like, kind of leverage that success for herself as partners. Let's take a listen to, and I want to make sure I'm sharing my audio. So one sec, I'm gonna stop sharing and then reshare just to confirm. Because I know you have to click a little button. Yep, I've got it. Okay. So we're gonna take a listen. This was the trailer for her show. So when we talk about a trailer, this is the best way to start. And this is a great example of a simple one. Just you talking about what the show's about. Introduces the show, introduces the energy, the tone of it, and gives listeners a look ahead to what's to come. This is also a great way that if you don't have a podcast and you want to invite someone onto your podcast, but you don't have anything to show, you could just record a trailer and attach that to an email and say, here's the trailer for my podcast. It hasn't been released yet, but sharing in confidence so you can get a feel for what the show's going to be about. So here's Angela's trailer about her show.
Welcome to Scale Conscious, a journey for fearless founders building brave brands for a better world. I'm Angela Wallace, I go by Ange. I'm a trained conscious capitalist and I've been a brand champion for nearly a decade. As we continue to navigate a challenging pandemic, supply chain issues, and never-ending cost increases, leaders are under more pressure than ever to figure out how to prosper with purpose. We've witnessed some cautionary tales and seen some of the pitfalls that come up in mission-minded leadership. So what are some strategies for startups to build better businesses and sell with soul? I'm inviting some of the most visionary folks I know to help me answer that question in my first podcast series. Together, we'll explore how to create conscious companies with compassion, conviction, and courage, and share how we can redefine a regenerative future for all. So go ahead and subscribe to Scale Conscious wherever you listen to your podcasts.
There you have it. Really simple, sweet, and you could see she actually put the full script up as the description, which is actually a nice accessibility piece so people could follow along as they're listening. But for longer episodes, Apple does now include transcripts, so you don't have to manually put it into the description like this. But a great trailer that she was able to put out there. And start her show with. So if you want to take a listen to her show, Scale Conscious, highly recommend. She has 2 seasons of it now. And she's like, I've done 2 seasons and it's really done everything I wanted it to do. So I'm good. And she's going to stop. And I think that's also great to know that you don't have to start and do 1 podcast a week indefinitely forever. And then you're on some hamster wheel. You can really be intentional. She started off with 5 episodes. I think her second season was also 5 episodes. Like she just did 5-episode chunks because she felt like that's what she could handle as an entrepreneur. Great. And that's what we were able to do. So her episodes themselves are a chat cast. So that's a really good example of a chat cast if you are indeed listening to that. All right. Now let's listen to another one that's more brand focused. Oh, and I will say with Angela, she wanted to also position herself as a thought leader, right? So that's why she chose to put her face and really lean into her as a personality. So it was relationship building, but also building trust with herself as a leader. This is an example of one where it's more of a brand play. So this is the Tinder podcast. So you might recognize that Tinder logo for dating. Their podcast is called DTR, Define the Relationship is what it stands for. And I'm going to just play a little example this podcast, I thought it was a very smart brand play, because what they did was they would take a dating trend that would be pretty accessible to anybody who was single, and they would then bring on a Tinder expert to talk about the research and stats around that trend. And so they were able to position Tinder as like the dating experts. And so they would have the trend, they'd have the expert explaining how this trend has evolved, what stats and numbers are they seeing from the app. And then they would go into hearing like actual dating stories from people who use Tinder or people who are dating and whatever. They did a little journalistic story. But I found it was really brilliant how they positioned Tinder as the like experts with regard to the stats and trend commentary. So this is an episode from season 1, but let's just take a little listen to get a sample of what it sounds like.
Hey guys, before we start the show, a warning that on DTR, we talk about they smile in return. Nice salad bar. And you briefly lock eyes with the hottie across the room. But wait, maybe they weren't looking at you at all. Were they just looking at what beers were on tap? Anyway, you flash a smile. Oh, they smile in return. Nice. But now, if you want it to go any further, you have to open your mouth and say something. But what do you say? You don't even know if this person's interested in you or just being polite. And that's the peril of the real world. But matching on a dating app? That's a whole different story. You skip right past the mysterious flirting to, you matched. But then here we are again. The fuck do you say to this person? You already know there's interest, but now you have to back up and talk to each other. Either way, eventually you arrive at the same place, that first communication, that first message. And you know, people read into first messages. They're agonized over, analyzed by friends, screenshotted and shared. If you're like a lot of people using online dating apps, whether you want to or not, whether you hate yourself for doing it or not, you usually say one word. You say, hey. 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 Hey, I'm Jane Marie, and you're listening to DTR, a new branded podcast from Tinder about defining relationships in the digital age. On today's show, hey. We've all received that message. 3 letters, no context, just HEY. In English-speaking countries, each month, more than 500 million messages are sent on Tinder. 500 million. And guess what? 1 in 5 of those messages on Tinder, that's 100 million per month, start with the word hey. Those 3 little letters just might be the defining characteristic of dating in the digital age. Hey is everywhere, but it's also controversial. Some people think it's a plague of lazy messaging, and some people think it's just how you play the game. So how did we get here? Have people ever known what to say? Even back in the day, we had trouble breaking the ice. In the 1800s, dudes would hand out cards to women they were into, for real. They called them escort cards. They looked a lot like business cards, except instead of where you'd have your phone number and your Twitter handle, they had stuff like this written on them.
You are sensible and good, and have all the charms of womanhood. Your eyes resemble the stars above you. I shall be miserable if I can't love you.
All right, I'm going to
Hey,
pause
guys.
there. So this was a great example for many reasons because it really mixed the formats. So I'm just going to go back to formats for a second. It's you had a little bit of voice acting there that feels like a scripted podcast. You had some sound scoring and some scripted opening with historical facts, which makes it feel very narrative. But later on, you get into conversations and chats, and it turns a little bit into a chatcast. So this one really mixes all the formats up, but you get the idea. I was talking about how they leverage the stats, and even though it's not a chatcast, you're still feeling like Tinder is the expert in the room because they're the ones providing these numbers. And interesting to hear about how many people start off a message with hey, like specifically the hey as a message. So you're learning a lot there. So this is a great brand play for thought leadership and brand affinity for Tinder. So you could take a listen to that podcast if you want to hear more. And the last example that we'll listen to today is another, this one's a real it's a brand affinity, but it's a little bit more nuanced. And this is through a scripted podcast called The Message. And I like to share this one because this is a very creative way to lean into that brand affinity. So this was done by General Electric, GE. And it's not about GE at all. It's about a fictional story about aliens. But they wanted to highlight really cool technology throughout the episode. They talk about being innovative and forward thinking, like just the larger themes of the story is what General Electric wanted to align itself with. And so we're going to go look at their site. So you can see here, it's the podcast on Apple Podcasts, and you could see even like they put a little brand mention, GE Podcast Theater, so General Electric gets listed there, but you don't even see full mention of General Electric in any of this write-up. So very interesting to see how they've positioned their brand and how it's more just very light brand affinity. So we're gonna listen to the trailer for this podcast, which is called The Message. So they actually have two here because they did two different stories. But the first one was The Message, and this is the one that got a lot of popularity when it was released. I think it was released in 2015, so a bit older now, but let's take a listen.
Meet your next audiobook listen,
Host of The Message.
Settled Scene. That's all
Trying to fast
before the
forward the
real
ad.
thrill and gore begin. This deadly thriller by New York Times best-selling author Christopher Golden
my
is now available on Spotify.
Okay, now it's gonna start.
Hi, Nikki Tomlin here, and I'm the host of The Message. I'm going to take you into an elite cryptography think tank, and check it out. Their top project right now is to decode a highly classified radio transmission from the 1940s.
Have you listened to it yet?
Not yet. We're having a discussion about that. But if I offered you the chance to listen to it right now, sounds like a no.
Well, we don't really know what it is. Voices, music, breathing. But you know, I'm not going to mess with that thing.
To sum it up, extraterrestrials. Subscribe to The Message on iTunes.
So that's it. There you have it. A very scored really nicely with music. You could tell, I mean, that was a voice actor they put filters on to make him sound like he was on the phone. Really well done production wise. And if you're into sci-fi, I definitely recommend you taking a listen. And you can see this was done at a time when subscribe on iTunes, that was before Apple Podcasts was even branded as Apple Podcasts, right? So you can see how the industry has evolved since then, which I find very interesting. I'm mindful of time, so I'm actually going to zoom ahead right to getting started if you are wanting to, get into making your own podcast. Here are the steps, all right? Step 1, define your goal and define your audience. So we talked about how different types of goal settings, and also thinking about who are you speaking to? Who is that target audience? Who are you making this show for? Really do that foundational work of setting up your podcast for success and being really clear about that, because it's going to dictate all the decisions that come next. Step 2 is show development. So that's when you're picking your format. You're going to pick your name of your show. You're going to pick your theme music. So you're going to get all the creative elements ready and your show artwork. Step 3, episode mapping. So this is what I recommend people do, is take a moment to really think about, all right, what are the first couple of episodes that I'm going to commit to? Maybe I'm committing to 5 episodes at a minimum. Okay. What will those 5 episodes entail? What guests?
Amanda?
Yep.
Sorry, Amanda. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. Yes, your slides aren't showing. Sorry.
Oh, thank you for clocking that.
Thanks, Cindy.
Oh my goodness. Let me read.
You're welcome. I was like, we need to read this.
Yes, that's an important one to read. Okay. Is it sharing now?
No,
No, yeah, no.
we see mountains.
Oh. Maybe it's sharing now. Can you see it?
No.
Oh,
Oh, now we can.
wait, you can?
Yes.
Yes, we could now.
Oh, okay. It got wonky on my monitors. All right. Thank you for clocking this. All right. So take a picture of this slide. Yes, it's a good one to have. Step 1, define that goal and audience. Step 2, show development. So that's the creatives, the actual format. Step 3 is your episode mapping. We're going to get to look at the actual episodes themselves. Who are you talking to? What topics I'm going to cover? If it's just a one-person show, that's fine. Still plan. What are you going to talk to? What are you going to talk about each episode? Because once you start putting the mic on, it's like all your ideas just pour out, and then you're going to be like, oh, well, I covered everything I wanted to in one episode. And then like, it's easy to just get overwhelmed with information. So really just being strategic on how you're going to break up the themes for each episode, the topics for each episode, the guests. And the last one's recording and editing. And that's when you actually get to hit record and let's go. And so if we want to look at some tips for recording and editing, here's some tools that you might want to consider. I do think so. To answer that mic question from the beginning, you can definitely just record right into your laptop. It's not the end of the world. Mic laptops are pretty good these days. If you would like to invest in a little something, I think that what can really up the ante is a microphone like the one I have. I use this for all of my calls, but also for recording. It's under $100. It's the Maono AU-AO4. And it comes with the stand and the pop filter, and it usually ends, it's on sale all the time on Amazon. It's usually like $70, sometimes $60. So I just think that's a great bang for your buck. This microphone plugs right into your computer. So it's just a microphone. It's a USB. You go right into your computer, and that's how you would use it. There definitely are more advanced microphones that would have different cables, and you would need something to input it into, and before it could go to your computer, and like it's a more complex setup, more room for error and higher investment. But honestly, a USB microphone does wonders. And I think for beginners, I just recommend going this route. The only thing to be mindful of is that if you're doing remote recording, like you're going to connect over Zoom, it's great. If you're in the same room, you cannot plug 2 microphones like this into one computer. You would need 2 computers, or you'd have to look at a different setup. So this is ideal for someone who's just going to like do their own thing and maybe connect with someone virtually. And if that's where, and you know what I would recommend is like, that's a great place to start. It's just easier. And then maybe you can move towards in-person setups if this goes well, right? It's nice to not try to bite off too much right out of the gate. Some nice headphones, over-the-ear headphones that are not Bluetooth. And actually, it's quite hard to find non-Bluetooth headphones these days, weirdly. But the audio definitely is sacrificed. Also, Bluetooth headphones tend to have a microphone, and it's hard to override that. And you'll kind of mess up your input settings every time you try to do a recording. So just get a, plain old plug that goes into your computer for your headphones. So I like the Sony MDRs, but even if you just get earbuds that plug in, no Bluetooth, that's what I'd recommend. And these are some tools to help you that I listed at the bottom to help you with recording and editing. So Zencaster is what one of the programs that my company uses to do remote recording. So you could definitely use Zoom. Zencaster would just be a slightly elevated version of that, where you're going to get a higher quality of recording. You do have to pay for a subscription, but there is, I think, a little free trial that you can do, so you could test it out. And it allows people to join, nothing to download, and it just runs in your browser. And you can record audio only, or you could record video and audio, or you could choose to have the video on so you see each other, but you're only recording the audio. So I think that's nice to have those options. And then Descript. I like this to recommend this for beginners because Descript is really making moves in the editing space. And so what they've done is they give you a transcript. It automatically generates a transcript of your episode that you've recorded, and then you can edit the transcript and it makes the edits to the audio. So if you do not know how to edit audio, I would recommend, you can learn yourself for sure, but that's a big commitment and you got to be ready to like get your hands dirty with editing audio. And there's lots of YouTube tutorials. Second option is you can hire an agency like mine to do the editing for you. And we would just do the edit so you don't have to worry about it. Lots of people do that just to help them focus on what their expertise is, which is the content. The third option is this, Descript. So you're doing the edit, but you're not like taking a master class in editing. You're just doing edits with the transcript. But the warning is that of course, sometimes it doesn't sound that smooth. You're editing text and sometimes people speak and they like put two words together. And so when you edit the text on the page, it looks like a clean edit, but when it's implemented in the audio, it might sound a little bit jumpy. But I still think it's a good place to start, and you can experiment with it if you are really wanting to do it yourself, but not go deep into learning how to do like really complex edits. So these are some tools I like to recommend. And then my last slide is about distribution. So how do we get it out there? How do we get it into the world? Well, you've got to upload it. It's got to live somewhere. And then you sync it with the other platforms. So I think people sometimes go, how do I upload to Apple? You're not actually uploading to Apple. You're uploading it to a hosting site and then you are syncing it with Apple. And so Acast is an example of a distribution site that you can literally upload your audio to. It will live on Acast, and then through Acast you are syncing with Apple Podcasts and Spotify. I put YouTube up here because YouTube is making lots of changes with their podcast functionality. Right now you'd have to upload it separately to YouTube. You'd have to upload it on Acast, sync it with Apple, sync it with Spotify, and then upload separately to YouTube. But YouTube has said they're going to be making some new adjustments where you can make some moves in podcasting, because we do know that lots of people use YouTube to listen to podcasts. So keep an eye on those updates. You might be able to at some point sync it all in one place, but right now you do indeed have to upload it separately to YouTube as a video. So if you weren't recording as a video, gotta just make sure it's in video format for YouTube, and the other places you would need it as an MP3, the audio. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing now, and I'm here for the last couple minutes to answer any questions.
Yeah, if you have any questions, feel free to unmute yourself and you can ask.
I have a question.
Yes.
Okay, Amanda, you rock at this.
Oh, thanks.
This has been splendid, and I'm so grateful that this is unfolded. So thank you kindly.
So sweet of you to say. Thank you.
Yeah, no, it's the absolute truth. So I do have a podcast that I've been doing for a calendar year. So I'm not sure in the modern verbiage if that's a season.
No, that's great. Yes, and everyone uses season differently. So yeah, full year. Yes, that's huge.
Amen. So I have a I'm learning from one of your pictures there. I'm actually hitting a number of the different formats.
Nice.
Because the podcast it's actually 3 different podcasts in one. And I've just discovered that from hearing you.
Wow, great. It's giving you the verbiage to be able to talk about your show. Like, I think that's important too.
Well, and so I'm trying to formulate my question because I'm so excited. I've done over 100 posts. So wow. I all the recording and all the editing, I'm fine with that. But the next steps that I'm hearing are letting more people in the world know. Is that something your company helps people with?
Yes, we definitely do. And I think let's have a follow-up chat. I'm going to put my email, and this is for everyone. I'm going to just put my email in the chat. If you want to shoot me a note and ask any other follow-up questions, and if we don't get enough time to answer here, just please reach out. Happy to help. And yes, from a marketing perspective, very quickly, there's lots of tactics. There's a social media approach that we really recommend. It's around creating 3 assets per episode with a very strategic way of releasing. But we also do some more traditional marketing. And I think a lot of people don't realize you got to market your podcast. And so we do pitching where we pitch other podcasts. So you go on another podcast to promote yours, because that's one of the biggest ways people find out about podcasts, on other podcasts. And we also do some coaching around submitting for promotion within the podcast players. So for instance, Apple, you could submit to get it highlighted within the Apple app. And if you are chosen to be highlighted within Apple app, which I've had several shows, like you'll get 5,000 downloads overnight. It really will take your podcast to the next level. So these are some marketing tactics you can take once you're in that kind of a position.
Cool. That's very exciting.
Yeah.
I would like to, speak with you further, because I don't want to monopolize the time here. Thank
Yeah,
you.
send me a note and we'll set some time up. Andrea, did you have a question too? I just saw you unmute. Okay, we'll do one more and then we'll wrap.
Yeah, I have to agree with Cindy. This is fantastic. I'm very excited.
Yay.
So I have a question because I listen to a lot of comedians. So I'm thinking about Conan O'Brien. So he does a Zoom and then it becomes a podcast. So I'm just thinking about him, how they're doing it technically. Are they adapting the Zoom as a podcast, or are they doing it simultaneously?
So what they would do is take the audio, they could strip the audio from the video and then put it up as just the audio. But yes, it would be recording it all in one chunk and then separating it separating it out. So you could definitely do that, but there's like an extraction process that needs to happen. With Zencastr, what's nice is you get them separate from the beginning. So you have the video and you have the audio separate, and you can then, but then what you have to do is, if you want to put it up as video, you have to mesh the audio and the video together, but then you already have the audio extracted. So I think in both cases, there's a step to do before you're able to publish. So just being mindful of that. But yes, good ear.
Yeah, because I'm just thinking about it, like if someone because I'm also thinking about an interview series that I would do on YouTube. So I'm just thinking, do I need apples and apples and oranges and oranges? It's what it sounds like it needs to be.
Yeah, because so Spotify, for instance, does allow you now to upload a video, but Apple does not. Like, you need it to just be audio. So you do have to take that step at some point if you want it up everywhere. Yeah.
Fantastic. This has been really great technical knowledge that I needed. So I appreciate you.
Oh, you're so welcome. Thanks for the kind words. All right. Well, let's wrap it up there. You have my email in the chat. I'm also very active on LinkedIn. So if you want to add me on LinkedIn, if you look up Amanda Cupido, I should come up pretty quick, and just say a note saying that you were in this session, and I'll accept you, and we could keep in touch that way too.
You're in Canada, eh, Amanda?
Yeah, I'm in Toronto.
Praise God. Thank you. Hard to find Canadians that are, no, really, it's just, so this is really awesome.
Yeah.
Okey-dokey.
Yay.
Well, thank you so much, Amanda. We really appreciate you coming today and speaking about this. It was so knowledgeable. So I learned some stuff too. So thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. And we look forward to having you maybe present again sometime in the future. So we'll keep in touch.
I would love that. All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.